Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. How's it going? How's it going? Hi, Ed. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Michael.
Good. I just want to let you know. My donkey decided to take a left when I wanted to go right.
Oh, really? I thought you weren't going to be here.
That's what I mean. My donkey changed its mind. My slow donkey decided to come here because I was reading what was going on, the commentary, and I was inspired by the dialogue to rethink my decision.
Okay, good. Glad you're here.
Yeah.
Might just be us.
Yeah, it might be. I might be. It might be. We'll see. I'm sure that I have a lot to learn from what you're saying. I really like that one video with the Greek finance minister.
I stumbled across that rather unexpectedly, and I was just looking for something, and I stumbled across that, and it seemed to reflect kind of like the tone and tenor of what I wanted to approach, because he doesn't get into any the real detail. I mean, he throws some facts and figures and things around, but the whole idea is like, well, what are we really talking about? You know, what's really the issue? Right. And that I think is too little understood.
Yeah,
but it is also.
I like it. I sorry to interrupt, but I like his critique too of the frozenness of the architecture that we've been working with.
Yes, he got to experience that firsthand.
Right. Hi, John.
Hi, John.
Greetings.
Okay, good. We can hear you.
And you were saying, Ed, he got to experience that firsthand.
He got to experience that firsthand, yes. He was on the, he was part of the team that had to meet with the Troika to resolve the Greek debt crisis.
Right.
I'm making a cup of coffee. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Well, I just found it interesting how he articulated a point of view about, you know, the political and the economics that I've always felt there was a disconnect here somehow.
Mhm. Well,
he articulated it to at least enlarge my point of view of understanding.
Yeah. I think this is it's one of those things that we don't really think about a lot because it's not fun to think about.
Yeah.
You know, it's too easy to get wrapped around the axle too quickly. And that was my experience, for example, tutoring strategy on an MBA program for almost 15 years.
Right.
Everybody kind of has an idea, but nobody really delves into it because it just seems to be so terribly complex or overwhelming. And I don't think it is. Well, it is. It's terribly complex, but I don't think it needs to be overwhelming. And I think having a basic understanding of issues involved helps us figure out where are the chinks in the armor. You know, the we people always have to look for chinks, usually down around the knees somewhere. But
I did like his quote from Einstein: "If you're not confused, you're not thinking."
You're not thinking, yeah.
And so, you know, and I think that's the thing, is just based on my experience of learning how to work with that sensation of confusion and learn to work with it in such a way that, well, there may be a good thing about this. Yeah, it doesn't feel good, but there may be something good about acknowledging, yeah, I'm confused, instead of default reactions that just, like he says, perpetuates the numbness. You know, the whole architecture that we're living by.
Are we getting ready? Are we recording? We are recording, right?
This is since Doug wasn't coming. He said it was just going to start recording.
Okay.
At some point, we'll formally start, and then he'll know when to make the cut.
Okay.
Now, I see that Mindful AI is here. I'm not the host, so. That could be why Mindful AI is here with us, even if Marco.
So Marco is here, right? Or is that Mindful AI? Is that a robot, or is that a
AI? It's not showing as Marco. I think as eerie as it might be, it could be that the system's just watching us.
Okay, that makes me feel very secure.
Yeah, really,
so in other words, no one is flying this plane. All right,
we're all on autopilot, John.
Okay.
Let's get naked then. Let's get naked.
No, you guys get naked. I'll watch.
You guys can, whatever you want. But, I'm not sure we've taken off. You know, we just may be sitting in a simulator somewhere, not knowing.
Yeah, that's true.
So, I don't know.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yeah. You there?
Oh, good. Okay. I'm not at my computer, but I'm listening.
Oh, okay. All right. We were just debating whether or not you existed.
I think I do. That must mean I do, right?
It sounds like you. So I'm going to trust that. And are you able to talk and listen at the same time, or? So I can't see your face. I just see a black box. Can you hear me? Respond to me?
Yes, I can hear you. And okay. I didn't know that Doug wasn't going to be here. I was partly relying on being able to coordinate with him when I wanted to make him participate in the dialogue. But I will listen and let you begin. And if there's any technical help needed as far as the host function, I can help with that as well.
And you will be then participating. Am I right?
I'm not committing to participate right now because I don't feel totally ready to discuss the topic.
Okay, I was going to direct a few questions your way if you were participating. But if you're not going to be participating, I'll redirect my attention elsewhere. That's why I'm asking. So
I see.
It's a technical question. but I don't want to prepare remarks for an audience that isn't here.
Well, I am the audience.
Sort of a waste of
I am
everyone's.
listening. I'm
Yeah.
listening and I'm present, but I may not be. I may in 30 minutes or so be in a place where I can't speak.
Okay, that's great. I would really appreciate it if you don't mind if you let us know you're leaving. So I won't be
certainly.
to a black box that doesn't.
No, I called in because I wanted to listen.
Okay.
What I'm not sure about is the speech part, but I will be listening the whole time.
So it's ambiguous. It's an ambiguous message. We're giving and receiving a lot of ambiguity, lots of noise.
The listening part, it should be clear. I am listening.
Okay.
And the speech part is ambiguous.
Okay.
So it's clearly ambiguous.
Okay.
It's unambiguously ambiguous.
I feel much better now.
Thanks for the clarity about the ambiguity. Okay. I appreciate it. Okay.
Least I could do.
Okay, but if there is anything that you want to say, don't hesitate to just butt in. You know, since we can't see,
Well,
we don't get.
I would signal it ahead of time, either by texting or raising my hand in the chat area. So I don't want to kind of come out of nowhere.
Okay, all right. I opened the chat window, so I can see that.
Okay, perfect.
All right.
I will mute myself now and let you begin because this is a very interesting topic.
So you're going to leave yourself now.
Mute myself.
Ah, mute. Okay, sorry. See, you gotta be careful when you're talking to an old guy.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I will hope not to mute myself through my muting.
All right. Okay, good. All right, so now that we fooled around long enough, I guess we could probably get down to the business at hand. There was nothing on tap for the cafe this evening, and so Doug asked me if I'd come up with something, and we kicked a couple of things around, and that's why I came up with the idea of politics, economics, and and as an afterthought, the title TANSTAAFL, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. And that in and of itself is kind of a tongue-in-cheek truism, aphorism that is used in the economics community to kind of bring home the point. It doesn't matter what happens or what you're doing, somebody's going to have to pay for it in some way or another. Now, a lot of the times that payment is in monetary units, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes there are other things. When we try to estimate or determine what the gross domestic product of a country is, for example, or a state or some entity, we do a lot of guessing about what that might be in terms of monetary value. So we estimate the amounts of goods and services in dollar terms in the United States or euro terms here in the Eurozone, or in yuan terms if you're in China, to kind of put a number on it so that we know, what is it that we're talking about? Okay, we got somebody. Oh, hi, Jeffrey.
Jeffrey,
right.
Can you move your camera? I can only see the top half of your head. Great, thank you.
Okay, excellent. Glad to see you, Jeffrey.
Hi.
All right, I was just starting to introduce our session for the evening, explaining where the acronym TANSTAAFL comes from, and the idea that in our, not just in our day and age, but for a long time now, we tend to focus on quantifying or trying to quantify things in terms of currency. And it is a way of describing things so that we can get some kind of sense of the relativity between, well, what are we spending on, I don't know, social services in a government, or what are we spending on military or on defense or whatever. So we can put those in relation. But the whole idea, the thing that really got me going about this was our discussions in the last couple of weeks. It started with long ago when we keep talking about how we're thinking differently or want to think differently or might be going integral or not going into, or whatever it is that we think that we're doing on the one hand. And we all recognize, especially those of us in the cafe, that things really can't go on the way that they've been going on. Something has to change somewhere. And one of the things that you always run up against when you're talking about change in any way, shape, or form is, well, what's it going to cost? That's the thing that kind of bugs me the most about most discussions these days. You can propose something. It would be good if we had a higher quality education system. And the first thing that you hear is, well, what's it going to cost and who's going to pay for it? And that's not really necessarily the essential issue. Maybe the way to a better education system is better teacher training. Maybe the way is to have more humane social system. Maybe they have nothing to do with education per se, and maybe it has nothing to do with money per se that gets you off on your first start, the step that you need to take. But things tend to get bogged down these days in money terms. And what I learned in the 15 years that I tutored strategy and business for an English university was that even the people who signed up to take these courses and to get these degrees didn't necessarily understand anything about that either. There was a very great deficit in knowledge about what an economy is and how it works and what it means to participate in one. And I thought it would be a good idea, since we were talking about over the last couple of cafes about very concrete political things, that we take this to another level, actually, because to me, it's not so much about the money itself. It's about the fixation on the money. And it's not, for me, it's not about the politics itself. It's, for me, there's a fixation on the binary polarity of it that irks me more than anything else. And one of the things that we have trouble doing these days in lots of areas is having a meaningful conversation about things that matter. And that's what I actually wanted to have happen tonight, is where we could have a sensible, reasonable conversation about, well, what does that mean in a context larger than what we're used to dealing with? And that's kind of how I tried to frame the teaser, the context, the seed questions for tonight, is to get this on a broader based footing, not just specifically, should we build a wall? I say we, as if I had something to do with it, in the United States. I don't care. I think it's stupid, but that's a whole different issue. It has nothing to do with the actual issues that are involved, because it's being reduced to a money matter, and it's not a matter of money. It's about everything except money. And so when I was looking for something to provide an impulse for what we were talking about, I stumbled across Mr. Varoufakis's very short video on capitalism will eat democracy, the full title being ... if we don't do something about it. Because he places the discussion in an entirely new frame for me. He's a burnt child. He went through, I was mentioning to Michael before we actually started here, he actually experienced firsthand what it means to confront the powers that be in the financial world, even though he is an economist. And the things that were going on and the things that happened to Greece back in 2015 and are continuing on today have very, very little to do with economics and finance. They have everything to do with making sure that an example is made so that others who get uppity don't get uppity anymore. And his reaction to all of that wasn't an overt and overly bitter reaction about all of the jerks and all of the bad things that were happening, but, well, what is it that we actually need to do about it? We're facing a lot of critical issues these days. You know, you can deny the science or you can accept it, but we have grave issues in global warming, or whether it's currency fluctuations. We're due for another crash economically. Every economist that I know here in Germany that's worth his salt is saying it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Some of them are surprised that it hasn't come already. The stage is set for these things to happen, and we have to go through a lot of these turmoils all over again. And his idea in the video at any rate was, well, he sees a way out of the dilemma, which is probably saying too much because it's a long road to hoe, is through an increase in democratization. And that, and now we come back to one of the things that came up in our discussion prior to this about the we people. It's in the end, it's little folks that matter. We're whoever we are, people, we make the vast majority of the denizens of the planet. And at some point, I don't know when it is or where it is or how it is, he has a few suggestions about this. When it is how it is, we have to be heard. And there's different ways of speaking. One can speak very loudly and violently, which I don't particularly care for. I don't think that's a good way to resolve issues. Or it might be in a more sane or productive way. But something has to be done and something's going to happen. We know that as well. And so what I wanted to get a feel for tonight was, well, what does everyone else think about this? Does anyone think about this? Does anyone actually think in terms other than the immediate political headlines that we see in the newspaper every day? And what does it mean for us? And is there, in fact, anything that we can do about it? Those are the directions that the seed questions were intended towards. And those are the kind of things that I was hoping that we'd be able to explore this evening. So that's where I'm coming from. And that's why I decided this was a worthwhile topic. And I'm very happy that you all showed up here to talk about this. And so I'm very interested now in kind of getting your initial impressions about, well, what do you think of these topics and where do you think that we stand and what do you think might be a good starting point, not just in the issues themselves, but for our further discussion this evening as well.
So I'm going to come from a very, my particular experience of being somebody that highly interested in these topics, these ideas, so I know how they influence me. But I'm very one of those people that is involved at the economic level that you talk about, Ed. I have a fixed income. I'm not sure what to do as far as the big picture, but I like to have these discussions so I can at least within a certain range understand them. I get overwhelmed a lot when I feel into it, but I do take from listening to these ideas and listening to that YouTube of probably just focused on how am I using my economic situation. And so I'm going to finish, but I want to understand the history of the word economic, because I think I have a very old one, and sometimes that's the trouble I have with the talk is I have this old one, and then now it's been abstracted beyond my ability, but that, you know, how am I going to use my resources, my economic with my limited income to help my children, to help homeless people, to survive myself, and how to do that as a political statement. Because I can't see that. That's one thing I liked about the YouTube. I can't see how politics and economics are separate. Like he pointed out, we've kind of nicely somehow over the years made them separate, and yet I think it's coming to bite us in the ass that we've separated it too much, maybe I should say. But I can see how the two can't be totally separated. They need to be worked with, because politics being defined as how to negotiate and work with resources across many different levels, and economics, in my limited point of view, is, well, what do I have available in my own resources and stuff to exchange? And, you know, we've been monetary system for so long that I think your point is taken, that we think that's the only way to do it. I think we have a very numerical monetary understanding of what wealth really is and how to grow wealth. I think it's been contracted around quantifying, and the biggest thing I don't like is, and he pointed this out and I'm 100% behind him, we don't invest in human resources through education or helping the poor. Just some poor people, they just want to exist and have their basic needs met, and we think that's terrible that people don't want to get beyond that. So I don't know what else to say at this point.
Okay, well, thanks. Well, that's helpful. John, Jerry? I can't believe that either of you have anything to say.
Oh, I have a lot to say. I just want to pace myself here.
Good. Glad to hear it, John.
Try to organize myself. A sensible, reasonable conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a very worthy goal. The question comes up for me is, what is reasonable and sensible when 1/5 of the coral reef has died in the last 3 years? And what happens if you are sane in an insane world? And perhaps when people tell you that you are not being reasonable and that will never work, that may just be a ploy to shut the discourse down, to support the status quo. Michael just mentioned his interest in a history of the word economics. He mentions living on a fixed income and what wealth really is. My response to that is, what wealth really is about the imagination. And if you have a healthy imagination, I think that's better than having money in the bank, although money in the bank is a good thing. But if you have money in the bank and no imagination, you can be very dangerous to yourself and to others. I've taken care of elderly people who had a lot of money, but they had, cognitively impaired. And so they were at very high risk, not just from nefarious people who wanted to rob them, but, they would go out and buy $50,000 worth of shoes, and they could afford it. You give them a credit card and they'll go out and give them money, they'll go out and throw it up in the air. So these are the kind of issues that I was very sensitive to, about who can afford to hire somebody, to watch somebody who has that much money and is cognitively impaired. But there are many people who don't have any resources who are cognitively impaired, and that's a different story. So I've been deeply involved in these kinds of issues. But I do remember about my personal history about money, and when I sort of discovered what it was, I was 8 years older than my youngest brother. I have 3 younger brothers. But I remember my youngest brother, I saw him potty trained. I saw him learn how to talk. I saw him learn how to walk. He was the first real love of my life. I loved my little brother. And I remember, I saw my mother. We were in a store, and as we left the store, he pulled out some candy out of his pocket. And she said, "Where did you get that from?" And he said, "Oh, I got it in the store." And she said, "You didn't pay for it." And he didn't know what she was talking about. He's, 4 or 5 years old. She smacks him. She drags him back into the store. He's crying. And she demands that he go up to the front of the cashier and return the candy and apologize. He was hysterical. He didn't know what was going on. And I saw him go up there, apologize. The cashier said, "Here, kid, this is yours." I think he felt very sorry for him that he had a mother like he had. But I was like, why is she being so harsh? And then I started to realize this. I started putting things together. I guess I was about 10 years old, maybe 11, that this was a really, really big deal. You don't walk into a store and take something off of a shelf and walk out with it. And I realized my mother had a positive intention, that she, you know, didn't want her son to become a thief, or to think that that was okay. So I thought maybe her reaction was overreacting, and it was a bit harsh. Yet I now, as an adult, realized there wasn't a positive intention behind her behavior. And so money, it's symbolic. It's a symbol. It's an idea. It's a concept. And it can mean many different things to many people. Some people can laugh all the way to the bank. Some people cannot. And I think these are the kinds of, as we have just shared an essay by Mr. Connolly, I think it's very, very tricky because we can be, our politics seems to be dominated by resentment. And I believe we're seeing a global backlash right now of this kind of a politics of resentment. This, by the way, none of this that I'm talking about right now is what I wanted to talk about. You know? This is so unpleasant, and I'd rather not think about it at all. And I think most of us tend to, let's numb ourselves as quickly as possible, rather than go into these liminal zones, which are so fraught with peril. And as you know, I just want to add, I think hopefully in this conversation, I'll get a chance to talk about what I hope to talk about. But Octavia Cortez, a representative who was a year ago a bartender in the Bronx. She's now on a committee that oversees Wall Street and the banks. I saw her in an interview where she just asked the pharmaceutical guy, she says, who has funded the research? And the answer was the taxpayers. And so when a drug that was funded by, the research was funded by the taxpayers, but that the profits are made by the pharmaceutical companies who have patented that, the findings of that research to produce this drug. And when a drug for a liver ailment costs $82,000 for the pills for 10 weeks of pills, $82,000. I think she's pointing to who's getting the free lunch. And I think that's a great question, usually used by persons who want to stop that conversation. But I think she's answering the questions, and she has the books in front of her. She can open them up, and she's in a position to ask these questions, and they have to respond. I think she's making some very good points, and I think she's recognizing that there's a pattern, a meta pattern of obfuscation and distortion. And I believe that the meta pattern basically is the pain is shared publicly. The gain is shared privately. That's a broad generalization, but I think it's a meta pattern, and it holds over many different domains. Anyway, that's my 2 cents, and I believe that I wish I had more than 2 cents, believe me, because I'm on a fixed income too. And, but I'll press the pause button and look forward to hearing differences or similarities or something in a transitional space. Many of us are trying to figure this out. And I believe we are transitional beings, and we're going through a gigantic transition as a species. And I'm cautiously optimistic. I think there's some brilliant people here and elsewhere that are working on these topics, and I'm encouraged. There are enormously encouraging signs, and I want to rejoice. And I also have to hold this despair very lightly, because it's easy to go into nihilist land And so I'm opening this up to the crew here, and with great gratitude that we're bringing such a serious topic into the open.
Thanks, John. I think we'll get back to some of the things that you want to get to, just as a matter of course, once we get through the first round anyhow. Any thoughts, Jeffrey?
Okay, so I'm not sure I'm going to be any coherent. I certainly agree with most of what John and John said. Probably all of it. I'm just holding a little bit. Holding in reserve the possibility to criticize something eventually. But anyway, I think I'm pretty well in agreement with it. TANSTAAFL is I read Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress when I was a young man. And of course, there are two jokes in that book. TANSTAAFL is the first joke, and why not is the second. And you have to have read the book to understand the second. But so I won't get into it. But and it was interesting when I looked it up, because I hadn't realized that it was an expression that was a lot older than Heinlein's book. And so it's interesting to see the sort of history about where the expression came from. In terms of the economics, well, I read a book again when I was a young man. So it was a book called The 7 Laws of Money by Stuart Brand. So the same Stuart Brand who developed the Whole Earth Catalog and a whole bunch of different initiatives, including a number of research areas as well that he was invested in. And but he wrote a book about money, and I thought it was a really interesting book, and one that I've gone back to and reread several times, because it's sort of a kind of a breakdown of what matters in money and what doesn't. A lot of what you said, Johnny, is reflected in the book. So, you know, that money is really an idea that more than it is anything tangible, and that you sort of have to line up things in fairly straightforward ways in order to sort of because people load on a lot of stuff into the idea of money, which isn't actually there. It's mostly in their heads. And so you have to line things up sort of in fairly straightforward ways in order to sort of make sense of things. And one of the other things that I've always felt about money, now obviously I'm a lot wealthier than some people and a lot less wealthy than others, right? So, you know, and so I have my own frustrations around money and in my own life, but I'm also aware that I have access to a great deal more of it than many other people. And so I have to be a little bit careful, especially given that as a researcher, over the course of my career, I have had access to and spent many millions of dollars as research money, not as my own, not as money I could spend on myself, but as money in the context of doing research. But I do kind of feel that, so I agree with your sensitivity about this, Ed, that people say, well, you can't do stuff because of money. But it's the question for me is always the other way around. It's you figure out what you want to do, and then you figure out the money to make it happen. I mean, it's true that you can't just figure out what you want to do and instantly find the money. Finding the money is actually a significant amount of effort in order to, but in a way, again, if you think through what money is a token that represents a bunch of other things, which are mostly resource things. And so when you need money to put something together, what you're saying is you need resources in order to have things happen. And the money is the leverage into the resources, but it's the resources you need, not the money. And so if you want to do something big, you have to get the resources to make the thing happen. And that takes time and effort. And, you know, so it's a way of thinking about instead of focusing on the money, you focus on the things that you're trying to do. And of course, the problem we have with the many large problems that we're faced now as a planet, as a population, as a planetary population, is that we have to mobilize these resources on a civilization level rather than on the individual or even the institutional level, which we know how to do, but we don't really know how to do it at the civilization level. No, we don't have the right systems in place to really do that, right? So I tend to think that the way, I don't think the issue is money per se. I think the issue is mobilizing resources. And, you know, and you can go back and say, well, it takes money to mobilize resources. Well, again, it's not quite, it's actually, it takes resources to mobilize money. You know, I mean, it's this flip that you flip back and forth between the two all the time, but you have to be very careful because in the real thing going on is the resources, not the money. The money is a thing that moves. It's just a token that moves. But you have to focus on what you're actually trying to get at. And so it's the resources, the mobilization of the resources, and figuring out as a civilization, as a planetary organization, how do we mobilize those resources at the level of the planet? Because that's how that's the only way we're gonna be able to tackle the ecological problems, or even the issues like poverty, which have been a long-standing, or, you know, all of the other related issues that we have to, you know, immigration and all of those problems can't be handled at the institutional level. So in the old days, we used to be able to do things by mobilizing a government or mobilizing a corporation, but now we're at the larger level and we don't have the right structures in place to do that. So I see the problem as a kind of a global planetary problem that we're faced with, of developing processes, structures, and organizations at the higher level, at the collective level, far beyond the government level or the institutional level. Now, obviously, one of the ways to do that is like you know, if I think about the Yellow Vest movement in France, you know, or the Occupy Wall Street, these are spontaneous movements that came out of the people that weren't organized by any one person. So in a way, some of those, neither of them were fully effective, but the power, the collective power, they tapped into a kind of collective power that is beginning to emerge, right? So, so I don't think it's completely pessimistic in terms of the processes that are beginning to be activated on the planetary level, but I think that that's where we need to look for the longer term solutions to these things. So I'm not sure, you know, there are no hard and easy answers in there, but there are directions to take, I guess, is what I think. Anyway, I'm going to stop there.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to say something, John?
No, who's third ear? I just see third ear. Do we know?
I'm going to guess that our listener, our unseen listener is, because he showed up.
Is that Marco?
Could be.
Okay.
I don't. I'm assuming that much, but we all know what assumption does. Assume makes an ass of you and me. Okay, so at any rate, well, okay, I'm kind of glad to hear the direction this is taking. I want to pick up on a point that Michael brought up. You know, well, what's the history of the word economics? And it's one of those, like anything else in the English language, we don't have words for anything, so we borrow them from others. When you're if you're in Germany, you make up your own native word for these things. So here it's called the Volkswirtschaft, which can mean a lot of things, because the Wirtschaft can be anything from what we consider an economy to the Gasthaus down on the end of the corner. So it could be the people's pub, or it could be, it could be that which kind of organizes us in some kind of financial ways. The Greek word itself is basically from the thinking about the household. How do you manage your house? And how do you run your house? Home economics was probably one of, I don't know how it was where you guys went to school, but when I was in junior high and high school, they still had a course called home economics. Mm-hmm. And most girls more or less were forced to take it. But as I was going through, there was an increasing number of guys who were taking home economics, because it's just a reasonable thing to do. A lot of people end up being bachelors, and it's good to know how to cook and sew and do those kinds of things. I had a mother that taught me that before I went to college. So I was able, on Friday nights, I was always able to earn enough money to go out because I ironed shirts for people that had dates. So you can sit there and you can give them, I'm going to wear a pullover. You only have to do the collar in the front, all the way down to you have to iron the sleeves. That costs more, but I could usually finance my weekend activities on Friday night. So that's actually the history. How do you manage? And this ties into what Jeffrey's saying. It's actually about managing resources. One of those resources can be money. It's not the only resource. It's probably not even the most important resource. It's just the one that we talk most often about, because it has, in a lot of ways, surpassed the others. When I was going through my MBA and my economics courses and whatnot, the three basic categories of resources were land, labor, and capital. And one of them, that land, was the physical resources, the water, the minerals, the coal, the sunlight, whatever that was. Labor was, of course, whatever we poor schmucks had to pour into it. And capital was given a special place in all of this because it was the money that was used to do that. And so how we manage these things in order to allow for something like a civilization to even arise is what becomes economics. So it's that thinking about how does that all play together so that we do the things that we do. One of the things I think it's important to remember is that economics itself as a discipline is extremely young. The first people have talked about it in a lot of ways. Aristotle talks about it, but not in the same sense that we would think about it in today's terms. And one of the first really well-known figures in the field is Adam Smith in his book, The Wealth of Nations, and which is kind of a founding document, at least in Western economic thinking. That's where the phrase, the invisible hand, comes from. Fun fact about The Wealth of Nations and the invisible hand. How often is it mentioned in the book? I love to ask this. I asked my nephew studying business management and finance, and I asked him, how often does it appear in the book? And he just looks at me, he goes, how should I know? I go, what do you mean, you haven't read it? And he said, no. Well, it appears once. The Wealth of Nations is a tome of 1,100 pages. It appears once in a relative clause that says, as if a invisible hand would regulate what's going on, and that's it. And then he moves on. And this has become like a key doctrine that we keep hearing and hearing and hearing about. But it's really nothing at all other than an afterthought, a side thought, an example of how things should work. So the guy that wrote it, Adam Smith, was himself a moral philosopher. And I firmly believe that you can't understand The Wealth of Nations unless you read the book he wrote before it, which is The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And I know at least two people who have been trying to read it for the last 5 years. Because if you want a good dose of 18th century prose, English prose, go right ahead. It's a tough nut to crack in that regard. So he was a moral philosopher, and most people who did economic thinking over the course of the 19th century were philosophers as well. Marx was a philosopher. He wasn't an economist in the true sense of the word. He talked about things. Ricardo or Malthus, all of these people that we hear about are great economic thinkers. They were either pastors, men of the cloth, or they were philosophers. And it had to do with what's just and what's right, and how do we come to terms with justice and correctness. And in the late 19th century, some folks decided it would be a good idea to formalize this. So I think the first, I can't remember where it was, it could have been the University of Göttingen, somewhere they established a chair for economics, and it was like in 1880. It's a very, very new discipline, as an academic discipline. The people who practice it like to think it's a science. I don't think it is. I think it's a branch of philosophy. You can have all the mathematical models that you want, but that doesn't make something scientific. It only makes it mathematical. But you don't have laboratories, and you don't have places where you can actually test a lot of the things that really mean something in your theories. You can go out and do studies, and you can look at behavior of people in groups, or however they're coming across, that might impinge or influence what you think. But on the whole, you really can't test it, because your mathematical model is simply a number of assumptions that you have put into a set of formulas that allows you to make what you think are certain predictions. And most of the time, these don't work. I think the record in economics is poor. Economics was also strongly influenced by Darwinian evolutionary theory, as it was understood by certain individuals in the late 19th century. Herbert Spencer being one of them, who is one of the early economic theorists, if you will, who signed up to the discipline. He is the one who came up with the term the survival of the fittest. It wasn't Darwin. Doesn't appear in The Origin of Species. Darwin's, I think, one of those people that people love to either misunderstand or misquote, because what he actually wanted to say, I don't think ever really comes across. We need to rethink how things come to be what they are, but it's not that they're necessarily so deterministic that if we know A, we'll always know what B is. So we run into this problem where people have picked up this ball and taken it forward and run on. We also talk about, for example, the Nobel Prize in economics doesn't exist. There is no Nobel Prize in economics. There's a prize given by the Reichsbank of Sweden for economic theory that's associated with the Nobel Prize, but Nobel himself never funded a prize for economics because it didn't exist. This was an afterthought that came up in the 70s. I think it was derived, something like that. So it's even newer, but it's called this because we like to think that we're dealing with something special. Now, the people who decided that we needed to have a prize like this and organize it was a group of economists who sat down in Switzerland and decided, well, we ought to have our own prize because we're worthy of it. And so this is how, in part, economic thinking starts permeating a lot of what we do. And it's really not about economics per se, because I don't know for sure exactly what economics really addresses. Because the things that are important, and these are the things that Jeffrey pointed out very well, how do we get to where we want to go, and what resources do we need to get there? And there was a time when all of our thinking in this land, labor, capital triad had to do with things that one could call real value. There's a certain amount of oil in the ground, and we can place some kind of a monetary denominational value on that. Okay. So we have X trillion dollars worth of oil around. But, and that ties into something. Through the course of economic development, like through the feudal system, everything at that time was based on land. Whatever you could get agriculturally, the surpluses were generated in agriculture before they were generated in, let's say, industrial areas. And so it was on the basis of these surpluses that a lot of the accounting took place, the valuation of money took place, the whole ideas of inflation took place. It was on the basis of what we would call real value. Well, at some point they decided, well, we need something that's universally tangible that we can all refer to. That's how we came up with the gold standard. When the land itself, when we started making industrial production and producing goods, well, the land wasn't exactly the key rooted resource that we could fall back upon. And so we moved to something else. It's been also an evolving idea. In 1971, as one of the last countries to do so, Nixon took the United States off the gold standard. And so at that point, we come back to what John said as well, this whole idea, it's an idea, it's a concept, it's a symbol, it's what you think it is. There's a lot of projection that goes into it. Well, which currency is more valuable than another is really just a matter of what certain folks think at the time and how rare they can make it appear to be at any given moment. And so it also comes into a very abstract, ethereal, non-substantial realm, and that's where we are today. When the financial crisis hit in 2006, just the on-book value of the CD swaps themselves in the banking institutions were valued at 6 times the world's gross product. 6 times more than all the economic output that the world is capable of. Well, that's obviously no value. It's simply an idea. And what bothered me the most about the worldwide reaction, for the most part, we'll exclude the Icelanders, they took a little different tack because they're small enough to do so, let's say, was that we acknowledged that that was a real number. But it wasn't. It's made up. Now, it does cause problems for us later. Jeffrey probably has to deal with this more than the rest of us because he's still, I would guess, looking for funding for things that he wants to do. And so you have to compete pretty hard in order to get grants to do the things that you think that are necessary to be done. So there's a lot of competition that gets generated over these kinds of things. And when we're spending money on saving institutions that probably aren't worth saving, there were other ways to deal with that, but we decided not to deal with them in those ways. And so that's also contributed to the bind that we're in today, that we can't really always come to terms with, well, how do I access the resources? I'm really glad that Jeffrey brought up the Occupy movement, the yellow vests, and the other idea or the thought that comes to mind was the protests, the Native American protests from the Keystone Pipeline, where again, this is really, there were 0 resources available other than human beings. They showed up and they did whatever they thought that they needed to do or could do at the time in order to make themselves heard, provide resistance, delay the constructions or whatnot, whatever it may be. But the real resource in the Occupy movement, the real resource in the Yellow Vests, and the real resource in the Keystone Pipeline protests were people. Were simply people. It was people who decided we need to do something. And
Ed,
yeah,
it's not labor exactly either, is it?
No, that's the point.
Knowledge
Yeah,
or something.
yes.
It's something not in your triangle.
Exactly. And this is the point. Thank you very much for pointing out, because this is the point I think Varoufakis is making in his talk. We in the economic people like to think of it as land, labor, and capital, but it's not. Economics is actually our resources, people, and I think that's where you stop. And so, because the capital part is, in all intents and purposes, a fiction. It can't be the money. Because as we've all noted, it's an idea. When the Roman Empire collapsed, there was obviously a scramble for valuable metals. Because even back then, coins were minted in silver or gold or whatever it was. So you need to have metal. So every coin in every realm was melted down. None exist, no coins existed. But I didn't learn in school, I'm sure none of you learned in school because they don't teach it in school. We didn't revert to some kind of barter economy in Europe when the Roman Empire collapsed. Things went on, life went on, civilization, a little bumpy, let's say, in the Dark Ages, went on before it recovered itself. There was 1,000 years where there was no money in circulation.
Can I?
Yeah.
Can I respond, Ed?
Ooh.
You've put a lot of things on the table there. I'm trying to catch up.
I'm hoping for somebody to react. Go ahead.
I go for complexity, and we've had these little spats sometimes about complexifying versus simplifying.
Yes.
And I think we can do both at the same time.
Okay.
But this is getting very complex, and I really appreciate that, because I think trying to oversimplify things can plunge us into chaos. Whereas if we admit, hey, this is tough, at least we can, I think, make more sense than just trying to make meaning. And I think this is some of the thinkers that we've all been studying together, Gebser, Bendo, recently Bateson. Bateson especially, Nora Bateson said, don't worry about making meaning. Let's make some sense first. And that's really in the perceptual space of a person, how you make sense. And there's a mix of concept and percept and precept and definitions and history. And you've been bringing out history, a lot of historical, overview of economy. And we were talking about planetary versus globalization, what the differences could be. And so also both of you mentioned, Jeffrey and Ed, talked about the bind we're in and the the Keystone, the Yellow Vest, the Occupy movement. I marched with Occupy. So I saw that happen. I marched with them more than once. And I saw the violent crackdown too. I also have been invited to a march tonight, starting Times Square, going to Trump Tower. Refusing fascism is the organizing theme around this. And vision, what could a vision mean? That could mobilize people's resources, spiritual, psychological, social, monetary. I think these are open questions right now, especially as we don't mean the same thing when we're talking about nature. Nature is, I think, there are multiple natures that we are responding to, and depending upon our ontologies. I hate that word, by the way. Marco loves it. I don't like it. I like epistemology. I don't like ontology. But I have had to mature in our conversations here. I think I've recently come across another theorist. His name is Philippe Descola. He wrote a book called Nature and Culture. And for the first time in my life, and I've read Heidegger, I started to understand why I have such an aversion to ontology. And he does a great service, I think, because he says there are basically 4 ontologies: animism, totemism, analogism, and naturalism. We are dominated right now by naturalism. Naturalism, it's all about physical and physical and what is physical and what is interior. And each of these ontologies configure the physical and the interiors in different ways. Naturalism stresses dissimilar interiorities and similar physicalities. And so we are being, then this is, but he says, and I'll just quote him. I hope this makes some sense. This is taking me to another level because it's very difficult. He says, the levels of interiority and physicality, animism and totemism, along with naturalism and analogism, become elementary components of a kind of syntax for the composition of the world, from which the varied institutional regimes of human existence all stem. That's a big idea there, but I think we are in the midst of a gigantic transition as all of these ontologies are happening at the same time. I think this is what Gebser was pointing to with the magical, the mythical, and hopefully the integral would be a higher octave of those previous structures rather than trying to abolish those previous structures, which the deficient mental tends to do. And I think the deficient mental is very into that naturalistic idea. That I find probably is why I'm so hostile, have been so hostile to ontology, because the dominant ontology reduces me and my interiors and tries to turn it into, I'm nothing but these random brain states that can be modified by drugs, you know, and, you know, or I'm just the genetic code, which selfishly replicates itself. This to me comes out of this naturalistic ontology. And as I quoted last time, there's some very serious physicists who say that this naturalism makes no sense. And they are debunking, many physicists and some people who have been hardcore materialists are trying to reconfigure their disciplines because it's not getting good results. And it's not making, and they're trying to make meaning and they're not making much sense. So these are the kind of things that really keep me up at night. And I'll apologize for this long-windedness, but I'm really working on this. I'm quoting from a real, he's an epistemologist, a philosopher of science, Paul Feyerabend. And I believe this brief paragraph, he really does say something that I've always wanted to say, but can't say quite as well as he does. But I think he has a very kind of Gebserian feeling. So I'd like to get some feedback from you guys. Because he's pointing out the ontology and epistemology are linked, as well as ethics. You can't separate this stuff in any reasonable way. But he says, if we want to understand nature, if we want to master our physical surroundings, then we must use all ideas, all methods, and not just a small selection of them. The assertion, however, that there is no knowledge outside science is nothing but another and most convenient fairy tale. Primitive tribes have more detailed classifications of animals and plants than contemporary scientific zoology and botany. They know remedies whose effectiveness astounds physicians, while the pharmaceutical industry already smells here a new source of income. They have means of influencing their fellow men, which science for a long time regarded as non-existent voodoo. They solve difficult problems in ways which are still not quite understood. Building of the pyramids, the Polynesian travels. There existed a highly developed and internationally known astronomy in the old Stone Age. This astronomy was factually adequate as well as emotionally satisfying. It solved both physical and social problems. One cannot say the same about modern astronomy. And it was tested in very simple and ingenious ways. Stone observations in England and in the South Pacific, astronomical schools in Polynesia. For more detailed treatment, he goes on to list some sources. And then he goes on to say there was the domestication of animals, the invention of rotating agriculture, new types of plants were bred and kept pure by careful avoidance of cross-fertilization. We have chemical inventions. We have a most amazing art that can compare with the best achievements of the present. True, there were no collective excursions to the moon, but single individuals, disregarding great dangers to their soul and their sanity, rose from sphere to sphere to sphere until they finally faced God himself in all his splendor, while others changed into animals and back into humans again. At all times, man approached his surroundings with wide open senses and a fertile intelligence. At all times, he made incredible discoveries. At all times, we can learn from his ideas. So I think he's offering this idea that let's don't throw it all out. Let's use all of it and use all of it well, magical, mythical, and rational, healthy, rational. But let's do something. He says we need to separate. We attempted to separate state from religion. He says we now need to separate state from science. And it's his view that science has become the worst kind of religion. Anyway, I just want to open that up. Thank you.
Can I ask just for 2 points of clarification? The third, animism, totemism, analogism, like an analogy?
He calls it analogism. I don't pretend to have mastered any of these definitions.
No, but does it come from the word analogy?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
okay. Then I have an idea.
And there are many people who have an ontology, which is mine. I'm an analogy. I run my system through analogies. And I'm not the only one. We can all do totemism, animism, naturalism, analogism. We are all able to do this, and they bring forth different kinds of nature. The nature-culture relationship pivots around these kinds of ontologies. So anyway, that's, I think, the good news. We have
it is good. It is good news. I just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. I'm the old guy with the hearing problem. Let's not forget that. I think a fun fact in that regard, back in the day, back when I was just coming out of college in 1970, 71, to go to graduate school back then, a lot of graduate schools required that you take an aptitude test to get in. And now we have the graduate aptitude test. I think that's the one that's become standard everywhere. But there was another test that many, many schools, especially many elite schools, use, and it was the Miller analogies. And it was 41 analogies that you had to complete. That's all it was. It was simply analogy, because if you couldn't think analogically, the thinking was with them, you probably wouldn't make it in advanced study because you were going to be running into difficulties. And so analogical mentation, thinking, here's an ontology, whatever. I can understand how you can come to that kind of a conclusion and want to include it in your list. So the other point of qualification, what's the guy's name?
His name is Philippe Descola.
Oh, he comes from Descola, because you had mentioned Paul Feyerabend.
This is Feyerabend. I just quoted that long passage because I thought he was sort of integrating these different ontologies.
Yeah, okay.
But I think he has a Gebser kind of feel to him.
Well, he does have. Could you spell his Feyerabend?
Yeah, it's F-E-Y-E-R-A-B-E-N-D.
Okay.
And I will post it.
Okay, if you would put both of those references in the cafe, up in the wherever we put our texts or references or links, where up there where you put the video for.
And I think he complements William Connolly's book, because I think Connolly's making this plea, let's create these, what he calls pluralistic assemblages.
Yeah.
Let's find, it doesn't matter if you're an atheist or you're a believer, we can still find common ground so that our differences can become strengths rather than undermine us. So, thank you.
Okay. Well, one of the points saying is, I'm like you. I don't like to I like to make things simple, but I don't want to reduce them. There's a difference, and making things simple and sorting out some of the complexity so that you can deal with it is one thing, but reducing it to it's just this and nothing else is simply a bad way. We're going to get into trouble.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more.
Right.
I mean, we need to do both, and sometimes at the same time, and we need to do it even better than we've ever done before.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. To me, it's always this as well as that. It's never this or that. It's always as well as that. And what can I get out of that as well as? How can I bring that into it? This is why, the land, labor, capital triad was a reduction, because it doesn't have to do with it. And if we look at it, and let's, just for the sake of argument, say, well, capital has a place in all of this. Capital, if you read Varoufakis's book on the history of capitalism, he points out, Graeber points this out in the debt book, you don't get to capitalism until about the 18th, 19th century anyhow. We have things that kind of look similar or pre-runners of it or whatnot, but it's hard to discuss them as purely capitalist undertakings. Adam Smith, even when he's writing in the late 1700s, is talking about shop owner capitalism, not massive capitalistic, the influx that comes up with the industrial, the mechanization of the industrial revolution, 100 years later. So even if we allow for that, let's say, and I wouldn't call it capitalism, I would call it surplus, because that's what it's all based on. We have more than we actually need. And what that more, whatever that is, whatever it consists of, that more, however it's perceived, also needs to be put into this process, this interaction of these elements, in order to generate whatever it is that is needed at the time. It could be momentum, it could be a new approach, it could be another institution, it could be a quasi-institution that bridges a gap between two states of whatever it is. One of the things that I find very interesting about Conley's book as I'm going through there, since he is an American, there hasn't been a chapter where he hasn't mentioned the cross-regional general strike, which I find an absolutely, from my understanding of North America, a very radical statement to be making. Over here in Europe, general strikes tend to get instituted a little more often because, let's say that, when Greece puts on a general strike, it's usually contained within Greece, but it can spread very easily. The Yellow Vests, for example, are now no longer in France. They're also in Belgium. They're in the Netherlands. They're moving to other places. People are picking up the idea and going with it. There are some cultures here within the Eurozone or within Europe that are more, let's say, resistant to those kinds of things because of their histories, we'll say. So you don't always have that same activism. But my feeling is that you're on the right path when the organized institutional response is as massive as it is. We've just had the second, there's been more than one death from the police for the Yellow Vests. They've killed more than one person. They just put another one in a coma for no reason at all. Because they're shooting around incendiaries, and they're bigger than just rubber bullets anymore. So the whole apparatus to respond to these things has become massive. When I look at how they cleared the parks in the Occupy movement, when I look at what the response was to the last G20 summit and the one before that, there are still people that are on trial here in Germany for things they allegedly did during that time. It doesn't bode well. It's a good intimidation tactic on the one hand, but it doesn't bode well for what's to come, because it only increases, I believe, that sense of rage that we've all kind of noted underlies a lot of our reactions and actions these days, where people are getting very, very fed up. And if you don't understand and you don't perceive that we have avenues of response, then those are the kinds of things that happen. In all of these cases, and I think that we've mentioned with this resistance, they're not the ones that are starting the violence. But the moment you react to the violence in any violent way, then you're automatically the focus of attention. Of course, your resistance to state authority is a crime in this country. But yes, Michael.
That's just like in basketball or sports. It's not the person that gets called is the one that responds to the original offense, usually, But so my feeling on this, that's listening into this, and it's interesting that Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. And the reductionism seems to, from my point of view, and this has been a contention since I challenged my own father's authority of telling me, you do what I say, not what I do. And that ethical component that has been lost. I don't want to generalize all multi-millionaires are unethical, but it feels that way for my low level, And so when we're talking about this economics, I'm just wondering if I'm just stirring the pot of the ethical component that that has been lost, it seems to me, from what I understand. The little bit of understanding of way back when I read Joseph Needham. He wrote a book about it that was trying to say originally Puritans felt that 10% goes back into the community, and so there was an ethical component to how you use your capital or what you do with it. That's not just hoarding it unto yourself. So, is that a legitimate thing to bring forward?
I think very, very much so. One of the things that came out in our discussion about Mark's book was that a lot of this rage that is underlying a lot of what's happening is, I'll say it this way, a perceived sense of injustice.
Right.
Whereby, in many, many cases, it is actual injustice.
Yeah.
So that's, you know, we first perceive it as such, and then we realize, well, I am being treated unfairly is not, I don't think the right word. I'm being treated unjustly. Because there was a time, there is a big difference between what's legal and what's just.
Oh God.
Yeah, because if you go back to, you know, both of those words come from the Latin. Lex is legal, that's where that comes from. And you can have a law, but that doesn't mean that the law is just.
Yeah.
I know that we put a lot of people we put a lot of Nazis on trial, rightfully so, after World War II, but they didn't violate any laws other than laws that at that time the victorious powers said generally apply, and they are internationally true. And that was a matter of instituting justice as opposed to the legalism. You can always have unjust laws. It's critical, I believe, in the upbringing of all human beings. I tried to do it with my children, that just because I issued an edict doesn't mean it can't be challenged.
Yeah,
But
right.
I had long discussions with my stepson at the dinner. We always were able to have dinner together, which was a nice thing about when I was working in California. We always had dinner together, and I would quote unquote punish him for something, and when he'd go, okay, if that's the way it is, and I would get all over his case for not challenging it.
Yeah.
Get up and tell me why you think that's not right.
Right.
Because a lot of times it wasn't right.
Yeah.
Action, it can be a lot of things, but sometimes it was simply, I want to hear what you have to say about this. I want you to think about why I'm doing this and how you can react to that.
Well, and my parenting, one of the things that I brought forward because of my old parenting was this very touchy thing with parenting when I needed to address the issue, but my emotional reactivity was just way out of whack.
Yeah.
And one of the things I did differently than my father, because he was raised in the actions speak louder than words, so his go-to was not to come back and admit that he was wrong with the way he challenged, he punished me or corrected me, because that would be a sin, and I'm just exaggerating. But with both my children, because I was influenced of understanding child development, the ability for a parent to lower themselves or get on equal ground to apologize to a child teaches them respect, because you're modeling respect, that you're willing to apologize to them. I did apologize for how I responded, but I did not give up why I was responding to it. That kind of interaction, from my point of view, is what's lacking even in terms with adult relationships.
Well, it is, for any number of reasons. We, for the longest part of human history, there was always some religion hanging around in the background.
Yeah.
And they've always had a lot of negative impacts on people.
Yeah,
right. We have to acknowledge that. But the essence, the foundation of all religions worldwide, I don't care what they are, is fundamentally, whether they're applied this way, this is the difference between what I say and what I do.
Yeah.
But The fundamental basis of every religious grouping that I can think of on this earth is the golden rule, or what we call the golden rule. But there's some kind of reciprocity that is involved in how I act towards others and how I expect others to act towards me.
Right.
And that is the fundamental human social condition. This is why Mr. Darwin said, well, when he first heard about genes, well, maybe there is a cooperative gene, if that's a way to explain it. It was a new metaphor for him too. But cooperation is an essential element of evolutionary development. You can't get there without others. Nobody does it on their own. Now, our neo-Darwinists, Mr. Dawkins and co., they like to talk about the selfish gene, and it's all about the gene and nothing else. But, well, when you take a closer look at it, you realize it really doesn't make any sense. So I can't see what you mean, because you're not making any sense to begin with, to use Nora Bateson's approach to that. That's why it's like, okay, well, I can't talk to you because you're not making any sense.
Well, and that's why I have difficulty when I do engage in talking about capitalism with people, my friends, and even business owners, like with the coffee shop I work with. You know, it's his business, I get it, but I was coming from, you know, this approach that, because I was an employee, is, you know, you need to treat me with as much respect if I do something wrong as you do the customer. And he came from the old school. Well, it's my stuff. I don't, you know, it's a at-will state, so I'm going to get rid of you. And that was a tough conversation with some people that I think, from hearing from your everybody here and hearing from your history, so many people have what I would call misinformed understanding of economics and capitalism specifically. Even myself, when I talk about it, sometimes I'm amazed. God, I'm stupid. I don't know that much. I mean, that's just the way I phrase it. That's all.
Can I respond briefly? I mean, this is so complex, but we've talked about somatic intelligence and the cognitive, the theory making, the map maker, and the somatic. And earlier, Ed mentioned the unfair and the unjust. And how do you know the difference between unfair and unjust? I think and how do you know the difference between unfair and unjust without the soma, the somatic self? And I'm also drawing upon, I think you mentioned Polanyi and the Great Transformation, that text, which I've not read, but I did read. I read his brother. There's another Polanyi. Carl Polanyi is an economist, but there's another one who's a phenomenologist and an epistemologist. And I have read him. He talks about tacit knowledge. That's the background knowledge you're not paying attention to, but everything runs around our collective tacit knowledge. And the difference between unjust and unfair, I believe, has something to do with our institutions. And tacit knowledge, that background knowledge, it's extremely important that our somatic intelligence resonates, vibrates literally with what's compatible and what's not compatible, what I can eat, what I cannot eat, what makes me sick doesn't necessarily make someone else sick. So that's a somatic kind of difference that we register. But also that tacit knowledge that I draw upon from my personal history, you draw upon in your personal history, is going to be different. But some of that tacit knowledge we're going to share. You know, if I'm driving a car on a road up a mountain, and here comes another guy driving a car, and we know which way to turn to avoid one another, you know, because we have a tacit knowledge so that we don't crash into each other. But I think this tacit knowledge also enables a great deal of, you know, fluid, you know, action schemes that we can follow through with, but also it holds a lot of our dysfunction, because a lot of our tacit knowledge is based upon institutionalized racism, sexism, and homophobia. And there are persons who have internalized that. And when they hear someone who's gay or Black or a different gender, they will know it's not a good thing to be biased, but somatically they will respond in a way that they, if they're sensitive enough, will recognize is not appropriate anymore. You know, you may have gotten away with this when it was old white men who were running the world, but they're not running the world anymore. And if you have these gut responses, you need to have enough capacity to hold that tension. And rather than fly into a rage. And I think I'm having to quote Shakespeare because I think he said it best. How with this rage shall beauty hold a plea, whose action is no stronger than a flower? How with this rage shall beauty hold a plea, whose action is no stronger than a flower? So not only is it ontology and epistemology and ethics, it's also aesthetics. Can we move towards a way of being with one another that is driven by aesthetics rather than profits for a few? And the metaphor I'm using now comes from, I can't remember his name, the guy who wrote Scale, Jeffrey West. But he says, we're running on this, basically capitalism works with this treadmill. You're on a treadmill, you jump off to a faster treadmill, then you jump off that to an even faster treadmill. That's what innovation is. And there are a lot of people who are getting sick of it. There are a lot of people who never wanted to get on the treadmill to begin with, and there's some who want to get off of it. But I think that this, to make gigantic profits for a few, everyone has to get on this treadmill. I think that is starting to collapse and unravel. So anyway, I'm just sharing that with you guys. How can we move towards relationships that are driven by aesthetics rather than how can I monetize this guy to maximize my profits in this next quarter?
Which, and I think you raise a very important issue at this juncture, John. In the religion of neoliberalism, the purpose of business is the maximization of profits.
Yeah.
That is the mantra. That is what's said. I did not attend one business course ever, except my own, where that phrase did not fall. It's somewhere in the course. I didn't preach that mantra because I don't believe in it. I don't think that's what you do. You can make it your mantra. You can say this is the highest command that you can follow within this, and this is the profit motive that John just spoke of. And the moment that you do that, everything else becomes second. It doesn't matter how important you think that are. You can say our customers are so important. You can say the environment is important, but it's secondary. It's still on second place. It never makes it to number one because the profits are what drives everything else. And in a culture, and this is where Western civilization to a great extent has developed, where it's the old Oscar Wilde cynical remark, we live in a society where we know the price of everything and the value of nothing, because we simply put a monetary value on it and say, well, that's the value. And so it leads to absurdities that we can't reconcile. And what's becoming aware is, even for people, you said, well, maybe you're stupid, Michael. No, maybe you're just not as informed as you would like to be about something. Well, good. So you come and you sit in a discussion, you pick up this, you read that, and if you have a question, you'll ask somebody, because that's the way you function. And that's the way that we continue to learn and grow. And there are a lot of things about all of this that most of us, I don't claim to be an expert on economics and a capitalist system. It's simply, I have a little more insight because I had to deal with it a little longer and a little more intensely than most of the rest of you. But I would certainly not consider myself overly informed in this regard. I can learn things every day, and you learn them in the strangest places. Yeah,
you have a good beginner's mind, Ed.
But one of the just on that note, I'll put it up on there as well. Varoufakis in his book recommends Margaret Atwood's book on debt. It's called Payback. It's a very short book. I just got it on Saturday and finished it on Sunday. It is an absolutely beautiful read, enjoyable. It makes you laugh, cry, get goosebumps, and at the end you understand why. You had mentioned the word sin at one point, Michael. that's where she starts, death and sin, because and how they overlap in but basically religious thinking, but through our entire civilizational thinking over the course of the millennium. So she's really good at pointing that out. So, and having said that, I just derailed my own train of thought. It had to do with something that John said.
Maybe I could step in with a few comments. Some sort of personal things. I never read The Wealth of Nations. I don't think I even read one word of it. I did read a good chunk of Das Kapital. so that tells you a little bit about my economic background.
Which volume, Jeffrey?
I didn't read it all, but I read chunks of it. Although I tended to prefer Engels over Marx. I found him a better writer and a more social, more of a scientist than Marx is more of a philosopher and Engels is more of a scientist. And so I found Engels easy to read that way. For this thing about land, labor, capital, people, resources, and then whatever this other thing is. And I noticed you sort of tried to dance around it a little bit earlier. And so I've been thinking that in a way, the third leg of that triangle is time. Because what accumulated wealth is a way of and what capital is a way of delaying spending, right? The resources get converted into this thing we call money, which is a way of delaying this, rather than otherwise you exchange directly one labor product for another, you're in a direct exchange. There's no time delay on that. But if you need a time delay, then you need something to hang on to the difference. And that's money, but it's also capital in the other sense. So capital is a kind of, a kind of accumulated time in a way. And what's interesting about the time argument is that we talked about, so the delay, capital as a delay, but you also talked about the fact that the trials of people for the G whatever, Occupy and all the rest of those movements, which go on for years. Well, that's also another time delay aspect, which is, so there's kind of a two-sided thing to this time delay. One is wealth accumulation, but the other is the consequences in social and social, I guess, consequences for the people. And obviously wealth accumulation is this idea. So when you say maximize profits, I mean, again, maximize profits is not quite what we're talking about, because what you actually mean is maximize personal wealth, right? So, I mean, this is ultimately, when you talk about maximizing, a company maximizing profits, you're talking about individuals looking to maximize their own personal wealth, and perhaps independently of anybody else's, and who cares, what happens to anybody else, which is the ultimate sort of personal, go fuck the rest of the word.
Nihilism. It's nihilism. Yeah.
But I mean, it's there, certainly present in the capitalist system, and which leads to rage as a response, because these people, we're being fucked, right? So by these people who are trying to accumulate personal wealth, independently of any other consideration, and so other people then bite the bullet or pay the price for that, right? So, but the flip side of it, the opposite of accumulating personal wealth is, so what's his name? He talks about that in his talk. Varoufakis. He talks about the Matrix dystopia versus the Star Trek utopia kind of thing, which is essentially the Matrix dystopia is the accumulation of personal wealth independent of any other consideration. And the Star Trek utopia is the benefit of the culture, the group as a whole, as the ultimate goal rather than personal wealth, right? So, and the flip side of the benefit to everybody, so essentially we're talking about what to do with the surpluses that are over and above the immediate exchange. This is why time is the factor, because it's extras that you need to hold on to for a certain time in order to be able to do something with it, right? So one thing is to enhance personal wealth, and the other is to enhance the benefit for everybody else. But the flip side of the benefit for everybody else is a culture in which the collective needs override the individual needs. And so there's a fear, just like rage is the flip side of personal wealth, fear is the flip side of collective well-being, you know, which is, he talks about the Soviet, you know, experiment in that way. So this sort of collective over and above any individual will. So that is the sort of, those are the dynamics going on with this time compound. And time reminds me of Gebser again, because obviously it's another way of thinking about these things. So I'm not sure I have any final thoughts about that, but I just think that this idea of time and its relation to, you know, these different elements is a useful way of thinking about this without being able to draw any final conclusions about it.
I don't think final conclusions necessarily need to be drawn. I greatly appreciate you phrasing it this way. This is one of those things I was hoping would come out of a discussion like this, is that we can take things that are kind of there and everybody talks about, but now we're starting to talk about them in different ways. And we can say, well, and here's the analogy, well, this is kind of like that. You know, accumulation is actually some time. You know, time is, well, we do that, we say that all the time. Time is money, and we equate, you know, labor with an exchange of how much output I can do over a given period of time. That's, you know, what Gebser actually means by temporics and things like that. So he does focus on that to a certain extent, what he's doing, and we can bring that into what we're talking about here, because it gives us another way of looking at it, merely taking this triad that economists love to deal with and expanding it, has taken it actually out of the realm of business itself. It actually puts it on a new footing, where we can start thinking about things not just in terms of business, or not just in terms of private property, or not just in terms of wealth accumulation, which are, I think, the things that are generating our rage.
Right, and I believe that it's very complex here, and our language is so slippery. But you can value acquiring personal wealth, making money. That can be a value, and that can be widely shared. But it's not the same thing as a vision. A vision is something that has nothing to do with you personally. It has to do with the future. It has to do with others. And when you're dead and gone, that's what a vision is. It's not one of these glib statements that CEOs make about the maximizing returns on their investments. That's a value, and you can have that value, and others will have other values. And the CEO can also value his children and his grandmother and his neighbors, and you know, we have multiple, and can love to go out into nature, you know. But I think the trouble is when people with enormous amounts of wealth distort supply and demand. So you can have a species of fish, and there's a market that's generated around the fish and bringing it to market, and the price of that will be determined by supply and demand. And when the stock gets smaller and smaller because of overfishing, it gets too expensive. So people will stop because they can't afford it. And so there will be an adjustment made. A relationship with nature can be acknowledged, and the fishery can come, and those who do this for a living will monitor their behavior. except when there's a billionaire who does not care how much it costs. He will spend $100 for that fish. And so they'll go out to make that extra $100 for that fish until the species is gone. So I think that's where we're in that kind of dilemma, that kind of paradox, where we cannot rely upon CEOs to do the right thing. And I believe that Octavia Cortez gets it. And she's making, I think, a gesture towards re-educating us. And I think she's doing it, and she's also a gorgeous person. She's beautiful. She has a good message, and she's a great messenger. And I think this is why a lot of people are really frightened of her. And she's also the most popular politician on the planet right now. I mean, it's gone to the roof. So I'm just saying that all of this is not hopeless. And I believe there is a window of opportunity so that we don't have to join the suicide watch here. You know, there's those I think could are saying, well, it's all done, it's all over, and let's just get together and hunker down, and you know, let's open up that Jack Daniels, you know, and let's obliterate ourselves. And I don't think it's that. I think that would be you know, if you don't have a vision, why not? Just make as much money as you can and hunker down. But I think that the people perish without a vision, I think it says in Isaiah. And I think that's true back then, and it's definitely true, even more true now. But I think it depends upon what your ontology, your epistemology, for those of us who like to think about that stuff, if it monitors our behavior or suggests we can use our imaginations to think differently than just a knee-jerk reaction to the tacit knowledge based upon institutionalized slavery. I think we have we have that wiggle room, you know. And I believe that the more metaphors we have to choose from at this stage, at this phase in our development, the better. And can we, you know, and also let's drop the metaphors that don't work anymore, like the invisible hand.
Thank you, John, and everybody, because one of the things I've been working with, and one of the reasons I even decided to come on, because I didn't think I'd be here, is to come on here to actually challenge my cynicism that I kind of run across from time to time of dealing with these complex ideas and trying to maintain a vision in an insane world. And this discussion has broadened and helped me not be so sucked into the cynicism, which leads to numbing myself eventually. But everybody here too offers up a healthy skepticism that I think is very important at the time that we're dealing with this. And I really, I know I'm on the right track, because one of the tacits knowing is I'm getting goosebumps just giving voice to this. And the goosebumps are always a solid indicator from a tacit knowing that I'm speaking truth. So thank you.
Good for you, Michael. I'd like to link to what John just said and come back to something that you said at the very beginning, Michael. I think Ms. Octavia Cortez has a lot of work ahead of her, and she's going to have a lot of obstacles thrown her way. What fascinates me most about it is how apoplectic mature white males can get at the mention of her name. I don't know whether they're all bent out of shape because she's a hot chick that can dance, or whether she, you know, the things that come up, I'm just going, it boggles the mind. It is absolutely boggles the mind. So to take just a little out of that American context, it was in the Wolf video that I had posted as a reference. He mentions this, but the Labour Party in Great Britain, in the United Kingdom, which is not in power, the Thatcherites are running the show again. And when Tony Blair was in there, he did the same thing that Clinton did in America and that Schroeder did in Germany. He simply moved what was social democracy and at one time, I'm going to use the word simply because they're familiar, from the left, and he passed the conservatives they passed the conservatives on the right, which forced the conservatives to make this leapfrog into near fascism for the most part. That's the broad brush description of what's going on. And probably the most hated political figure by the establishment in the United Kingdom right now is the head of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn. And he is under massive attacks from all sides because he has said, as part of their party program, and this is where we kind of hook into, what John was just mentioning. It's part of their party program that if any corporation in Britain is going to be acquired or sold or whatever, they're going through a Brexit now, they're going to be on their own anyway before too long. He wants to inscribe in law that the employees of the corporation have the right of first refusal, which means the company can't be sold if the employees say no. And at which time they may buy the company. And they will be given loans by the governments to do that because they obviously don't have the capital to do that, so that they can take it over and mold it, let's say, in their own image. So there is an attempt in some places to use the system in order to infiltrate the system, in order to open up possibilities for other things. We're in the we're here in the Cosmos Co-op. The idea of cooperatives is wide-ranging. There's a lot of very successful co-ops in the world. Wolf also mentions in his the Mondragon Corporation in Spain, which is the 7th largest company. It's a conglomerate of countries, but it's the 7th largest company in Spain. It is entirely employee-owned, managed, and run. Now, this doesn't solve a lot of the problems that capitalism brings with it because they're playing within the system, but nevertheless, people whose livelihoods depend on where they are employed and how those resources are allocated, how people are employed, how they participate, and what this means over time are taking on new dimensions. So again, I think it's not just in the United States. There are signs everywhere that people are willing to entertain new ideas, and we need to do that. Now, one of the things that Varoufakis says in his talk is that we need to bring economics and politics back together. And Michael, I think, rightfully said, I think they're probably too intertwined as it is. I think there's a difference between having economics and politics together and having money and politics together. This is where money is simply a part of economics, not the mainstay thereof. The United States has enshrined that money is free speech. It's legal. It doesn't mean that it's just. It only means that it's legal. And that's what you have. Most other places, the amount of money that gets into the electoral system is severely reduced, but it's not eliminated. So we still have the same fundamental problems. And there was a time, this is another thing that I think we need to keep in mind. There was a time when the government was seen as actually having power, that the state actually had power, and that the corporations operated within that state. And so the whole notion of corporatism, that the entities of the corporation wanting to have state-sanctioned power, that is exactly the model of fascism. That is what fascism is about. That is what Nazism, that's what the Italians were. It's the marriage of corporations and business. What has happened in the meantime is that the corporations have divorced themselves from the political sphere. They make no political decisions, but they have all the political, we're back to our influence and control talk that we had this afternoon, John. They have all the influence in the world simply because they can exercise their free speech by allowing money to flow. And for them, it's just a business expense. It doesn't impinge on anything that they have from their own personal wealth or whatever as a result of that. So in many, many regards, the United States is dangerously close to a fascist organization. The people that are organizing the demonstration later, John, are onto something. It is there. We should also remember that America First was the motto of the American Nazi Party in 1930. That's what they campaigned on in the elections against Roosevelt and Hoover, was America First. So, history can repeat itself. We're at a tenuous juncture, I believe, but as John's pointed out, there's hope here. You recognize that, Michael? I have. I love Jeffrey's reinterpretation of this triad. It's given me a whole lot to now think about again. I can now revisit this in a more meaningful way. And since we are getting very close to the end, I would just like to say, John, I do believe that we have had a sensible and reasonable conversation this evening. Just to come back to that one as well, which is
how the fuck did that happen?
Yeah, I know. Well, and it was us. So, I don't really have any. We are getting close to the top of the hour, and I would like everybody to be able to say things. But for my part, I'm very happy for what's transpired. I've learned. This is why I come to cafes. I've learned a lot. And I've got a lot that I can think about. And I have new things that I can take to apply to what I'm doing. And I can revisit things that I thought I knew in a new way. And that is the advantage of what we do and how we get together here. So I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, for your contribution to this effort. Even a blind pig finds an acorn sometimes, John. So maybe that's what we're doing. So if anybody has any final words that they want to bring up before we sign off for the evening.
I had a question about America First. What's that bit of history? America First, back in?
That was a campaign slogan for the American Nazi Party in 1930.
In America?
In America, yes. There are rallies in John's right at the heart of that in New York City. It was in Radio City Music Hall, I think it was, Canadian. 12,000 Nazis standing there saluting, couldn't wait for Hitler to take over. They were there, and they were our in force. It's not an unknown phenomenon there. The South Carolina legislature in the 60s and 70s had a member of the American Nazi Party sitting in the state legislature for years.
And how were you using the fascists and corporation and business?
Well, when the corporations believe that the government is in charge, the thing that you do is you get in bed with the government. Mm-hmm. And the government protects you and you can do what you want. This is what fascism is. And there's a symbiosis that occurs that enables these entities to do what they want, however they want to do it.
So that goes along with what happened with that one Supreme Court, or the idea that corporations are a personality or a person.
That they have always been juridical persons. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that they're human beings, but they're being treated like human beings now. That was another one of those.
It's one of those things that
justifications of I have something that is a non-entity suddenly has the same rights that I do as a living, breathing human being.
So it can go down the road of fascism.
It
yes,
is.
Yes, it is fascism. That is fascism.
Okay.
Guys are damn close.
Okay.
No, I say we are fascist already.
Okay. All right.
They're already, and I have some personal anecdotes. And I agree with Nora. We have this dystopian fantasy about the future. The future, that dystopian fantasy is here. And I think this is what we're a little numb to. And because it's sensitive persons, this is going to hurt. And you're not going to make a big profit from trying to correct this and to reorganize. It's not something that's going to, be good for the next profit, the next quarter, So I think it's a vision. It's something that's beyond you, and it includes you, though. So I think we are much more than our history. We're much more than our bodies. We're much more than our minds. We have a mind, we have a body, we have a history, and we have a genetics, and we have a brain, and we're much more than all of that. And we're not here just to suffer. There's much more going on than just our personal suffering. Although we all suffer, but it's what you do with that suffering that I think is extremely significant. And there have been brilliant people who did a lot, who suffered intelligently and creatively. And I believe that could be an attractor for us all. But just briefly, when I was cleaning houses, I've worked for the wealthy, and I've been rich and I've been poor. Believe me, it's better to be rich. I've oscillated quite a bit. But I remember I was working, cleaning houses when I was performing and acting, and running a theater company, basically out of the tips I made waiting tables. And I pooled my resources with other performers, and we made things happen. But that was in a different world than it is now. But I remember I was cleaning houses, and I remember working for this man. It was Fifth Avenue, a brownstone. And I remember the guy was very polite. He asked me what I wanted for lunch. I told him, an apple, cheese, sandwich, that's fine with me. And he told the butler what I wanted for lunch. And he gave me a list of things he wanted me to do, taking care of this place. And he thanked me. He was a very gracious, kind person. Then I was talking to the butler, and the butler gave me some instructions about how to clean the bathroom. He says, you do not use Comet, you don't use a cleanser, because this toilet is made of gold, okay? The floors were made of marble, heated marble, gold all over the place. This guy shits in a gold toilet bowl. And I was in his bath, and I was in his bedroom, and I looked at the walls, his books. He reads a lot of the same books I do. And so we have cultural influences that are the same. I looked at the book that he was reading on the side of his bed, and it was called The Myth of Rent Control. And I live in a city where to subsidize if you want to have a servant, you have to subsidize that servant's housing. This is something the rich learned. If you want someone to work for you, if you want someone to clean your toilet bowl, you have to provide housing for that person. And so there's rent control, and there's stabilized apartments. And this is what allows working class people to work in a city as expensive as this. And when I saw that, the myth of rent control, I realized this very polite man who shits in a golden toilet bowl was really more than willing and able to dismantle this system, which provides him with a service that if he didn't have, he'd have to clean his own toilet bowl. So I think this is the dilemma as we've dismantled back in the 90s, the safety net in America. We're starting to see, great instabilities now, especially after 9/11 in this country. And a tremendous defensiveness, and a desire to protect our borders, to build fences. But that meant it worked in 1850, but it isn't going to work now. And I think this is something that, we're being plunged into this chaos right now. And, we'll see where it goes. But I do believe if we can find enough stability in our social lives, we can move to more complexity and to something that's more just and more fair than if we are responding in that reptilian kind of me first, strike first kind of ragefulness that I think is epidemic right now in the world. And it prevents us, it blocks us from tapping into those aesthetic dimensions, which are a tremendous potential that's untapped. In most of us, most of the time. But when we're in these kind of unstable situations, those aesthetic dimensions are extremely important for us to cultivate. So thank you.
So I do agree that, so final comment, I do agree that we already live in a world that has got strong fascist components to it. However, that said, I think we also live in a time of intense pressure from all different directions. And it is a time of change. And I don't think I think that the fascist elements have to settle into place for people to realize and react against them in order to put something else into place that is much more progressive. And so I think we live in a period, in a crucible. We're living in a time that is a crucible, and these various forces are engaging with each other, in a very complex way, as we've pointed out. And exactly where it will go is very hard to determine in advance. But that said, I don't think it's necessarily sure that it's going to go for the dystopias. I think, in fact, I kind of think that what happens with human evolution and change is that it follows the asymptotic line as close as it could possibly get. That's to say, it always stays on the knife edge between the two worlds, never leaves the knife edge to go too far into dystopia or too far into utopia, but it stays on this balance thing. Which means that you can never sort of let your guard down and just and relax and assume that everything's going to go fine. You have to keep working at it, and that's what everybody's doing. And then ultimately this thing is going to, I have a lot of confidence, but I tend to be an optimist, but I could understand if you were a pessimist, you would see all of the signs would reinforce that point of view as well. So.
Well, Jeffrey, I like you use knife edge, but I like the metaphor. I'm just surfing the wave of evolution at this moment. I think we're all supported by evolution, like you. I like the way you put it, but when you use knife edge, my metaphor went to, I got to surf this baby, and my feet's got to be on the board.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, actually. There's knife edge or just letting go, right? Which is the other way, right?
But with awareness, with a certain awareness that has an attentiveness, but it's also, it's alertness that is relaxed. Krishnamurti once, in talking about awareness, he talked about an alert, relaxed awareness. So you're not too relaxed and you're not over alert, panicking all over the place.
Right, the kind of relaxed awareness that you need to sing well. So in order to sing well,
thank you. That's good.
You have to relax. Thank
you. I like that too.
So thanks for a great discussion.
A technical question: is this going to be? We've recorded it, and who's the host? You're Jeffrey, or you know how to upload this, right?
I think maybe
I think Doug's going to take care of this.
Oh, you know how to do it, Ed?
I think Doug's going to take care of that.
I think it automatically goes to the site, and Doug does the cleanup afterwards to get it moved onto the forum. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, there was just a note that you were the host, Jeffrey, at some point.
Yeah, I think Marco, when he was host to start with, and he switched the host to me. Yeah. And then I think it switched somewhere else. But just because you need a host, otherwise the thing doesn't keep going. So.
Doesn't keep going, right.
And I forget.
We're gone.
I forget almost immediately what I've said on these calls. So I am one of those weirdos who likes to review because I can. That way I don't have to worry about taking notes or missing something. So it's a value to me as a researcher to have these videos.
Yeah, me too, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I agree.
I'd like to thank you all again, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you all.
See you next evening. I hope it's a pleasant day for you, or however, as they say in Germany, have a good rest day.
Yeah, many blessings. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.